Good afternoon. Welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists September 2020 webinar titled Urban Wetlands and Water Management presented by Bill Dooley from the Association of State Wetland Managers. My name is Louis Mantini, and I'm pleased to moderate this webinar with Marla Stelk, also from ASWM. Please advance. For those of you who are not familiar with our SWS webinar series, all of our monthly webinars are complimentary to SWS members and are usually held on the third Thursday of the month. Once each quarter, we open our webinars and offer them free to non-members and the public. As you can see on this listing of our upcoming webinars, we have both our regular SWS webinar series in English and also have quarterly webinars offered in Spanish. Our next free quarterly webinar will be held in December, titled SWS History, 40 Years of Globalization, and it will be presented by Catherine Ewell. We've been fortunate enough to receive benefactors this year and are proud to announce our initial sponsors, who include Water Resources, Hydrology and Hydraulics Education Group, and the Whittington Group. Water Resources, Hydrology and Hydraulics Education is a nonprofit group that shares information on water resources, hydrologic and hydraulic engineering to help educate and build a better tomorrow. The Whittington Group is a natural resource consulting firm that balances regulatory compliance with sound ecological management. You can find their information at the websites listed above, which will also be included in your webinar handouts. Our most recent sponsors include In Situ and WildNote. In Situ, monitoring equipment and software combined to make it easier and more cost-effective to collect, access, and manage water levels, water quality, water flow, and other relevant data. WildNote, which is a field data collection app for environmental professionals, streamlines the process of collecting, managing, and reporting environmental data so you can work smarter, not harder. You can also find their information at the websites listed above. Please visit these sites, like, and follow our webinar sponsors. We are also proud to announce that this webinar may be approved by the SWS Professional Certification Program as applicable for continuing education credits. These credits can be applied to your Professional Wetland Scientist certification or renewal or other certifications. These certificates are free to SWS members and are available for non-members for a nominal cost of $20. Participation certificates are also available for those who watch webinar recordings, which can be found on our past webinars page or YouTube channel. I note that participation certificates are available through an automated process where the participant receives an email from our SWS Managing Director, Michelle Chosek, about one day after the webinar. So whenever you do view these webinars, please check your spam email the day afterwards. Please advance. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. The general format for today's webinar will be a 45-minute presentation by our speaker, followed by approximately 15 minutes for questions. All attendees will be muted. If you have a question, enter it in the Q&A pane shown here, not the chat panel, at any time during the presentation. And you can type your questions in the Q&A button. Participants may also upvote questions in the Q&A that they want to be answered earlier. The chat pane should not be used for questions. Instead, if you have any technical difficulties or general comments, you may post them in the chat. And Jordan will be monitoring. She is our representative from SWS staff. She'll be monitoring the chat. Please be certain to download the handouts for this presentation. And don't forget to tweet about today's webinar at SWS Webinar. So with the logistics out of the way, I'll pass things over to Marla Stelk from ASWM to introduce today's presenter.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to introduce the association briefly first, and then I'll introduce Bill. The Association of State Wetland Managers is a national nonprofit membership organization established in 1983 to promote and enhance protection and management of wetland resources, to protect application of sound science to wetland management efforts, and to provide training and education for our members and the public. ASWM's members and partners include states and tribes, federal agencies, nonprofit partners, wetland professionals, educators, consultants, wetland enthusiasts, and many others. In the fall of 2015, I was very excited to lead an effort to get a memorandum of cooperation signed between our two organizations. So in the fall of 2015, ASWM and SUS did sign this memorandum in recognition of the fact that although each organization differs somewhat from each other in regard to objectives and missions and members, both organizations share the common goal of encouraging sound science in wetland research, management, restoration, policy, and conservation. And that meeting this goal requires enhanced collaboration between the two organizations and their various partners. Since 2015, SWS and ASWM have collaborated on many meetings, workshops, comment letters, webinars, and more. So we're very excited to be joining up with SWS again today for this webinar. Most importantly, it's my immense pleasure to introduce all of you to Bill Dooley, ASWM's newest policy analyst. Bill started at ASWM in March of 2019, and prior to joining our staff, he worked at Clean Harbors, where he managed hazardous waste disposal projects across northern New England. In his position at ASWM, however, he assists us in the design and implementation of policy and program research and analysis plans. He assists in identifying, writing, and carrying out federal grants. He facilitates various work groups and ad hoc committees. He coordinates and hosts webinars, and he identifies content for the ASWM web pages and publications. So he wears many hats here. Bill has a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Assumption College and a master of public policy with a concentration in environmental policy from the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth. And with that, I will pass it back over.
All right, great. Thank you, Marla. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you to Society of Wetland Scientists for inviting me to share this project, and thank you to everyone here that's joining me. It looks like we have a great turnout, and I really appreciate that. So as Marla said, my name is Bill Dooley. I am a policy analyst here with the Association of State Wetland Managers, and today I'm going to be sharing with you preliminary findings from an EPA-funded Wetland Program Development Grant project that ASWM has been working on since about March of 2019, looking at how to improve restoration and protection efforts in urban wetlands specifically. So I'd like to start off with giving a little background to the project, how we came to it. As is frequently the case with ASWM's work, the Urban Wetlands Project is actually building on some prior research that we performed. In this case, Urban Wetlands is coming from the Wetland Restoration Project, you can see on the left, and the Healthy Wetlands, Healthy Watersheds Project on the right. Wetland restoration really was looking at best management practices for wetland restoration projects that generally result in successful restoration results. A major finding from that, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to, yep, not for advancing my slides. There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you, Jordan. A major finding from that project was the necessity to approach wetland restoration projects in the context of the greater watershed for really achieving successful outcomes. Seeing that wetland as a component of the watershed and not separate from it. Having that kind of context framing is really important. And the Healthy Wetlands, Healthy Watershed project looked at wetland restoration, state-level wetland restoration and management programs that were framed in that context and integrated into other programs to achieve success. And what these two projects really highlighted was that urban wetland restoration and protection efforts either occur less often or face greater challenges to being successful when compared to more rural wetlands, with factors like land use plans and property value and land availability playing a major role in those challenges. And we see that, sorry, there we go, see that as a major problem because urban wetlands do offer a lot of value to the communities that they're in. Generally, it is true that urban wetlands are maybe smaller. They are, when assessed in a certain way, certainly less healthy in some circumstances compared to rural counterparts. And they certainly deal with a large number of stressors, like non-point source pollution, issues with historic land use, and such. But despite those facts, urban wetlands still provide a large number of very important ecological services and have a lot of value to human health and well-being. They help make cities more livable. Even though they are smaller or perhaps fragmented, they still reduce flooding in those local areas. They can help replenish drinking water, filter that water, provide green spaces and outdoor education. In the same way that larger counterparts do those, these urban wetlands also still provide these incredible benefits. And in a lot of ways, they serve an additional role in the sense that they're closer to population centers, making benefits like a reduction of the heat island effect or availability to outdoor education opportunities more accessible than say, a rural wetland. But despite these benefits, as the prior projects highlighted, restoration and protection of urban areas just doesn't see the same level of attention. People are just often unaware of the role that the wetlands play in their communities. They kind of have a bad public perception image or something to that effect. They can be seen as wastelands, primed for infill and development, a place to dump trash. And for local or state wetland or land managers, and oftentimes they can just be seen as too small, too degraded to really require or be worthy of the limited time and resources that they have available to them. So with that in mind, ASWM decided to approach this project with the idea of, how can urban wetland restoration and protection be enhanced or improved, and particularly with a mindset to how that can occur with a way to maximize economic, ecological, and social benefits to the urban communities that they are near or surrounding, or that are surrounding those wetlands. So, and we're coming at this project from 3 key focus areas. The first is the funding and financing is obviously a major barrier when you're talking about any kind of wetland restoration project, and particularly if you're talking about something that's being managed at a local level. Is how do we pay for this, and how do we maintain it long term are 2 very difficult questions that oftentimes are the first and last hurdle, because there isn't always a great answer. Another area that we're looking at is state and local policy tools or mechanisms that can be used to enhance or drive more restoration, maybe incentivize private involvement in restoration activities or improve protection in some capacity. And the third focus area that we're looking at this from is how mapping and other prioritization tools can play a key role in helping those local managers or state managers identify the most important or the most likely candidates for restoration and protection, and the role that those kinds of prioritization tools can play in an urban environment. So the major components or outputs that we have going on from this project, and we've put together a nationally representative work group of diverse experts that inform on findings and topics and important or maybe share excellent examples or something to that effect. There's a integrated mapping workshop series that's been incorporated into the project. A series of webinars that's being hosted through the Natural Floodplains Functions Alliance. And we're also working on recommendations that can perhaps for improvements to the core element framework and how states develop their state programs. But the main thing that's really coming out of it, I'd say that the primary output that we're developing is a strategic guide for urban wetland restoration and protection that will be summarizing the findings from this project. And that guide we are really trying to tailor towards the local level, and still providing information. It'll be geared towards what local efforts can be done, and how state governments or state programs can support those local efforts. And just to kind of, give a little bit of understanding too, we're really coming at this from like a big picture standpoint, not really and geared towards groups or individuals that are interested in taking this issue up maybe for the first time, or just starting to develop a program, and maybe not as much for people that are well into it and have a well-established program. This is more for those local level groups that are beginning to think about this process. I'll say one thing that we aren't doing with this is that it's not getting into the nitty-gritty specifics in the weeds about how do you conduct a wetland restoration project in an urban area. Partly because in a lot of ways, the wetland restoration project that I mentioned before already addresses that. The best management practices there, in a lot of ways, still address urban areas. They just need to be tailored slightly different for an urban area, for a specific project like that. So we're not coming at it from that kind of an ecological perspective. This is more of a, how do we help fund and instigate, propagate further urban wetland restoration work? So with that in mind, one of the first things that the groups did, that our work group did, was identify some of those gaps and needs, those issues and major barriers to why urban wetland projects maybe just aren't getting that same level of attention. And at the state level, probably the biggest issue is just the way that a lot of state wetland program plans are designed, is that the metrics don't particularly align well with urban wetlands. Many state programs are set up to focus on things like the size of a wetland, health of a wetland, difficulty in reproducing that wetland type, or the rarity of a wetland type, or the prevalence of things like rare and endangered species. And these are all important things to think about and focus on, especially in that large state level watershed scale. But when you talk about small, fragmented urban wetlands, they don't typically measure well on those metrics. That kind of results in a sense, in many states, a devaluing of these wetlands. They're not really being measured in the ways that they do support, and they're being measured in a way that they just don't, score well on. And so if you think about policies as a tool to help decision making, to achieve those policy goals, and this kind of a policy structure really results in urban wetlands just receiving less state level programmatic attention. And because of that, and kind of it's related, but it's separate, a separate and a big issue is the fact that because state level programs are set up in this way, mitigation efforts or requirements for wetland impacts in urban areas can tend to be transferred out of the urban area. Because those wetlands are maybe not assessed as highly, and the value that they provide in terms of health or animal habitat is not as high, and the requirement for the focus on mitigation requirements on area or something to that effect, or health, it makes it challenging to have those mitigation steps taken within an urban area. And in a lot of instances, that means that urban wetland impacts are mitigated outside of the urban area, which kind of increases, where we're already dealing with issues of a lack of attention or a lack of protection, and now it's almost a focus of development unless it's been specifically identified in some, which is the case in some states, but across the board generally, restoration can tend to migrate outside of the urban area. So those are the big issues at the state level. When you talk about the local level, you're really talking about limited resources. To some extent, it might be a lack of understanding that the role that the wetland provides, and that certainly is an issue in a lot of areas. But even where that's not the problem, the next issue is that governments, local level governments and county governments aren't always, or usually set up in such a way that they can just adopt a wetland protection program. That limitations on time, employee time or staff time, funding, financial resources, and expertise that was required for conducting these kinds of programs is not always housed at the local level, making it challenging for even when it is desired to take on these projects to initiate them. Another problem, and again, it's kind of similar. You might say that data is a kind of resource, but it's its own separate issue in a certain way. In that, another big barrier is when people do understand that wetlands provide services. One of the things that's really needed is local data on what kind of a role, what kind of function those wetlands can provide for certain services like flood retention or protection or stormwater mitigation or something like that. Having good, solid local data that isn't generalized, that can provide a good basis for cost-benefit analysis can have a huge impact on increasing the ability of a local government to both want to and be able to take on these kinds of projects. And you could say honestly that when you're talking about wetland functional data, it's maybe insufficient across the board, from federal down to local. But it's a particular barrier in this sense when we're talking about local adoption or management of urban wetlands. That lack of data is really, really problematic in a number of circumstances or a number of ways. So getting into kind of how the group has approached this, developing the guide, when we're talking about funding and financing options, we've kind of identified a lot of different ways that you can go about it, but we've broken it down into big picture things. If you're trying to get money for some kind of a wetland restoration project or program, you're probably going through some kind of a grant, a loan, a bond, or you have like general funds or tax revenue, or you're including it in some kind of a program or established program or something to that effect. And they have different strengths and weaknesses, which is something that we've talked a good amount about. Grants, loans, and bonds are all good for those project-specific things. If there is a specific wetland that you want to restore, and it has certain benefits that can be measured or assessed in a certain way, grants, loans, and bonds are a good way, especially if you're trying to just start a program, and if you're interested in kind of like a pilot example to highlight the role that it can play, and maybe that's going to lead to more work down the line or something like that. Grants, loans, and bonds are a great way to start. But they certainly have their limitations. They are not that long-term funding source that's going to continue. You may run into issues with maintenance of projects down the line from something that was funded by a grant, say. There's also a significant barrier at the local level of identifying the right grant or loan or bond opportunity, particularly when it comes to grants. I mean, there's just so many options out there, and identifying the right grant, finding it, applying for it, all takes time. It takes a certain level of familiarity with the information that's required. And then managing those grants is also another challenge, another burden that local governments are oftentimes just not equipped to take on. Especially when you talk about something like a grant that requires a matching fund, that can be a big barrier in a lot of circumstances. When you talk about loans and bonds, they also have the added issue of this potential negative implications for a credit score or credit impact. And there has to be an ability to pay that off in most circumstances. So grants, loans, and bonds are good for the right situation, but they pose significant challenges to local management on their own. And really, for that reason, a lot of the focus or discussion has been more along the lines of instituting or supporting those long-term funding mechanisms. It seems, when you talk about tax revenue, general funds, or implementation of a new tax, which is an example that I'll talk about, or programmatic, like adopting adopting wetland management into something that is existing, like stormwater management is a somewhat common one among the examples that we've identified. Incorporating that wetland management, protection, restoration efforts into a stormwater program seems to be, in a lot of circumstances, a great way to manage or have continual funding sources for wetland restoration and protection at that local level. But there are challenges to those as well. I mean, especially if you're talking about implementing a new tax that's not ever really going to be very popular, and just finding money in general funds is not typically a solution that many local governments would say is an option. And incorporating wetlands into an existing program requires that there either be added fees to pay for it, or that, again, that there's extra funding available to take on that kind of a work. In a lot of cases, the restoration and protection can essentially pay for itself. But there'll still be upfront investment to get to that point. And that really can be the challenge when it comes to those long-term programs. So a couple of examples I'll talk about briefly in that sense. The Atlanta Environmental Impact Bond is a really good example of a somewhat new type of approach to bonds. Is that the Environmental Impact Bond, which it ties the payback of the bond more towards the actual outcomes that are derived from the projects that the funds are used for. So, you have to see the outcomes and results that were promised to actually be required to pay back the funds. And the Atlanta Environmental Impact Bond is an example where they have gotten a $14 million environmental impact bond to help fund innovative green infrastructure projects to help mitigate flood protection and water quality issues across the city, particularly in the Proctor Creek watershed, which has included wetland restoration projects. And this is a really good, interesting case study. There's a few different environmental impact bonds going on across the country, actually, with Quantified Ventures. They're doing really interesting work with that in Buffalo and Virginia, I believe. There's a lot of them focus more on green infrastructure instead of nature-based or wetland restoration, depending on how you want to use the terminology. But they're a really interesting way to fund projects that are focused on results. Now, it's still critical in that sense that you need an agency or an entity within the government that can take on debt. There are examples where groups, states, or local organizations have approached this kind of project, and they can't move forward because the way that they are set up, chartered, their state constitution, they are not allowed to take on debt. That's going to be a big barrier when you're talking about taking on a bond. But it's certainly an interesting way to approach a project, and the Atlanta project is very interesting in that sense. The other one I wanted to talk about briefly was the San Francisco Bay parcel tax. The San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority was created in San Francisco in 2008 by the California State Legislature. And in 2016, they put a measure up for vote in the 9 counties of San Francisco Bay to institute a $12 parcel tax to raise about $25 million annually. Or $500 million over 20 years to fund restoration projects in the Bay. And this is another really interesting, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to advance my slide. I did it again, thank you. This is another really interesting example where the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority had a really good idea of what they wanted to do this for a little while, and they basically waited until they conducted outreach into the community to determine what the important issues were, what to focus on, and what kind of support they felt like they could get from the community. And they did that outreach a few different times in different years and waited until they felt like they had the right moment to strike. And then using the information that they used during that outreach, they conducted they put that measure on the ballot and focused on the issues that people were interested in, and they got a $12 parcel tax passed. which in a lot of places would probably sound pretty amazing. You know, to pass an additional tax for wetland restoration, or it's not necessarily always wetland restoration, but a lot of the projects are. And there are a number of really great projects that have happened in associated with that in phase one, as well as the ones that are currently funded or underway right now. And I would strongly recommend anyone to reach out or to look into that. That is just a great example of the importance of outreach and timing and communication, proper communication of the benefits of an urban project. All right, and so moving on into the geospatial mapping prioritization tools. You know, I depending on how familiar you are, this may seem kind of obvious, but again, we're kind of at that high level right now. The benefits of mapping and prioritization tools, it's hard to overstate. They can have a huge impact on improving communication and education with stakeholder communities, with interested, you know, not nonprofits or local public, private. It doesn't matter. The kind of you know, when you're talking about story maps, or if you're talking about, you know, just online GIS maps, the way that they can inform people of the value that wetlands play and the role that they can play, and display that in, you know, a visual way, that can have a significant impact on improving communication and understanding of the value of those wetlands. Probably the biggest and most obvious thing, though, is that if you have a prioritization, a map that you know, identifies the areas, the wetlands that are existing, that maybe potentially are good sites for new wetlands or something like that, it saves a lot of time in the wetland site selection process, and can also have a lot of really have a big impact on improving outcomes from those site selections. You have a good understanding of where your best chances are to have a successful outcome, where those sites are that are going to attain the results that you want to see. And it also operates, you know, when you take the time to incorporate that information into a map, a GIS map or something like that, there's also greater opportunity to integrate it with other goals or objectives, whether that be something like a stormwater program or a wastewater program, or something like social justice practices or something like that, or goals. You know, once you have that information, it's easier to tie different things together. You know, but something that's important to keep in mind is how data scale and complexity can really drive the usefulness of a project. You know, there's a number of, there's obviously, and it's kind of what I'm getting into on the next slide, so maybe I'll just jump ahead to that. You know, when you talk about NWI maps, those are widely accessible to everyone in the country, and they're there. But there's a significant limitation to how useful they are. They're especially at a local level. The data is oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes outdated. And there isn't a lot of information, specific information about functional capacity when you're talking about something like that. Tools like Virginia's WetCat or Wisconsin's Wetland by Designs, those kind of take it to another level. They do incorporate a lot more functional data that can be useful in an urban area. To a local community, and they certainly are. However, they still have that same issue of scale. When you're talking about policies and tools that are supporting policies that are focused out at that large watershed scale, as a state tool would typically be, it's not always dealing with the same issues that you're interested in, and it's not always focusing on the watershed scale size that's important to a local community that maybe that small urban wetland is really more functionally tied into. When you talk about local tools, you know, they can run the gamut in the same way that the state tools can, from NWI to something very specific like Virginia's WetCat. And that's not to say that either of these are lesser, or they're just different. The White Oak Bayou Wetland Prioritization Map is a great tool where they went through with HEM classifications to identify high, medium, and low priority wetlands based on priorities or functions that were most important to them. That has a big impact on being able to support how you protect those resources, how you prioritize development and prioritize protection or restoration within your urban area. And that's a really fantastic example too, because it's a collaboration between two communities. It's really focused on a watershed, a small watershed, but two cities or two local governments work together on that, which is fantastic to see. It's a good way to approach that kind of an issue. Similarly, the Lake County potentially restorable wetland layer, that's one that's just phenomenal. I suggest anyone to take a look at it if they can. I think there's actually some case study information written about it online. It's really interesting. That's a tool that was developed and enhanced from a wetland inventory that had previously been built. So they built in all kinds of information on function like carbon sequestration, native fish habitat, shoreline and stream bank stabilization. Quite a few functions are built into that. And they also identified historically existent wetlands to try and determine where there are sites where there aren't currently wetlands that could be good sites for wetland restoration or wetland creation. And that is also incorporated in their stormwater program. And they have a few examples of using like Section 319 funding to support a wetland restoration site that was identified with this potentially restorable wetland layer. It's a wonderful example of how a local mapping prioritization tool can help and enhance urban management and urban land management, wetland management, decision making, and what an important role that can really play. Oh, I went back. Sorry about that. There we go. All right, and I'm doing all right. All right. So last section, we are focusing on those policy tools, particularly that can be implemented at the local level. So one thing that we see is that in a lot of instances, local ordinances or land use laws is specifically geared towards wetland protection have a huge impact on creating successful wetland management in an urban area. States like Washington State with the Critical Areas Ordinances and Massachusetts Wetland Protection Act they offer a number of really great examples of how locally implemented, whether required or just encouraged at the state level, locally managed and implemented wetland ordinances can have significant impact on improving protection, particularly improving protection efforts. Other examples like the Maryland Living Shoreline Protection Act, that's a good example of ways to kind of direct development and also require nature-based solutions. That's not specifically tied to or specifically encouraging wetlands specifically, but it is something similar to that could be developed in a way that is focused exclusively on wetlands, and it doesn't even have to be. I mean, that's the thing, is that a lot of these projects are green infrastructure focused, but wetlands can be tied into green infrastructure or part of green infrastructure as well, or living shoreline, same kind of idea. It's just about increasing the opportunity for wetland restoration and protection in those urban areas. When you talk about mitigation bank and in lieu fees, there's a lot of times a very high upfront cost dealing with those. There's a lot of maintenance that goes along with that, depending on how you implement it. But if it is locally managed, locally maintained, then you avoid that issue of transferring wetlands outside of the urban area. You kind of take that on and create a market essentially for those kinds of projects to pay for themselves. There's an upfront cost that has to be taken on, but there's that local management takes away that transferability issue that we talked about before. And voluntary incentive programs like market mechanisms, bio programs, tax credits can do a lot to encourage greater activity from private entities and partners. It's really an important resource to consider if that's the step that you're at, the stage that you're at. Like the Washington, D.C. Stormwater retention or stormwater credit program allows the sale of stormwater retention projects to credits to developers to meet their permit requirements. And included in that is wetland creation or wetland restoration. So fantastic way to think about improving, both incorporating wetland prioritization into an existing program and to help fund in an urban area those kinds of projects. There are, of course, challenges to think about when you do that. How is a wetland in that situation? Is that a wetland? Is that a green infrastructure? How do you define that? Is there regulatory protections now that if it's a created wetland? It's those kinds of legal and language barriers can be a real challenge. It's something that our group initially dealt with early on, trying to lay out definitions, but it's something that needs to be think about, especially if you're going to be adopting these kinds of policy approaches, these kinds of tools. The language and impacts of wetland creation in particular, but also wetland restoration there's real legal ramifications that can sometimes be difficult to manage or take on. An example of those kinds of policy approaches that I think is interesting is the New York City Mitigation Bank. It's somewhat recent, and this was a really good example. This is a successful mitigation bank in a big urban area, but there was high upfront costs to taking on this project. There was a lot of required coordination between local, state, and federal entities to determine, get the right site, get the number of credits that were appropriate, determine the sale price, determine who has ownership of the land and who is conducting the mitigation. There was a lot of upfront coordination costs and planning that went into this project that would be challenging in a lot of circumstances. But if it's something that you can take on, it will pay back initially. It will pay back in the long run. Policy factors. The interesting thing too is that this really helped the state. I think one of the main reasons this really helped was or went through was that the state was also interested in pursuing it. The city was interested because it helped. It helped deliver infrastructures more predictably. And I forgot to advance again. There we go. It helped deliver those projects more predictably because it was easier for, in the small area that this covers, for them to know exactly how much it was going to cost for them to have some kind of an impact on an aquatic resource. But the state was also greatly supporting of it because it fell in line with a number of their goals associated that kind of came up after the hurricanes that struck the state on avoiding or minimizing storm surge protection and increasing natural habitat. There was still a lot of challenges between coordinating between local and state, but because the two entities both had their own unique goals that overlapped, this project was able to go through and has been really very, very successful. All right, so I only got a couple minutes. I'm going to try and go through these pretty quickly. So, these are certainly unpolished. We're not quite done with the project, but this is what we've kind of developed so far. And I'll say too that both of the next two slides, these are not intended to be a checklist by any means, that you should always be doing. Every state or local agency should be doing all of these. It's kind of a, assess your own situation, determine if it's a right fit, but these are options that can be considered. And for states that either haven't updated their program in a while or don't have a wetland program plan at all, incorporating a wetland program plan can do a lot, especially if you have the understanding that you don't want to devalue urban wetlands. If you have that urban wetland mindset, developing or updating your wetland program plan can go a long way towards helping local entities, local governments take on more projects and management of those. Another way, and kind of one way to do that, to have that urban wetland mindset, is to incorporate functional assessments, particularly associated to human health and well-being and not just ecosystem benefits, into wetland evaluations. Rapid assessment metrics or something to that effect. incorporating those functional assessments, those functional values can help elevate, or the potential functional value can help elevate wetland projects and existing wetland resources to a higher state, and maybe encourage greater protection, especially if you're incorporating something like flood protection and you talk about all of the infrastructure around an urban wetland. Incorporating that into wetland assessments should have a significant impact on improving their likelihood for getting state level programmatic attention. This is just kind of across the board, engage. For the state, it's about engaging local governments and understanding and other, big picture stakeholders, and understanding the values or the needs that are important to them. If you're going to take on an update of a wetland program plan or some other, maybe a big mapping project or something like that, being in touch with your local entity governments is an important step to take to understand what to prioritize. Where you have existing data resources, whether it's maps or maybe it's funding programs, making those readily accessible and are available to local governments so that they know that they are there and they know how to use them. That is an important thing to do as well. With any of these, it's challenging. I'm not saying the state has infinite resources either to take on these, and there's always limitations, but if you can do a few of them, that's always a good thing. And this is an important one as well. If you have a wetland map that just isn't being used very much, maybe a little outreach and communication as to the value and the role that can play for local governments would be a good thing to do and benefit everyone. Another step that can be taken is to help coordinate efforts at the local level. So, if you have multiple governments, local governments taking initiative or taking steps to improve wetland restoration and protection, getting them in touch with each other, sharing data, sharing resources, that's a good way to kind of lower the barriers, lower the bars to those local governments and help them take steps to manage these resources on their own. And finally, so provide financial and technical support. I fully understand that is not always possible, but it might be something along the lines of adjusting the way that your Clean Water State Revolving Fund is focused. You might, that's a funding source that's already there, and if you tailor it in such a way, if it can be tailored in such a way that it can be supportive of urban wetland projects, that could be a great way to help fund local management. Ohio's an example where they have done some steps with that. It's not perfect, but they have examples of urban wetland restoration projects that have occurred using Clean Water State Revolving Fund and lowering those barriers to avoid, so that it doesn't have to be perfect ecological outcomes or something like that. Focusing maybe on those functional values and the roles they can provide to human communities and such, can go a long way towards funding more of those projects from the state level at least. And finally, looking at the local level, the biggest thing really, I would say, is that critical need to perform outreach and communication to the community, to understand what it is that they are interested in. The next thing is to focus on functional value and that improve human health and well-being. And generally that is the case when you're talking about the role that wetlands can provide to improving people's lives in some capacity. That's typically the most successful way to go about wetland restoration in urban areas. But that doesn't mean you should assume what it is that the values or the functions that people are going to be most interested in, and it's not always going to be human health and well-being. The San Francisco example, it was actually everyone was a bit surprised because people were very interested in increasing natural habitat and area for birds. And that wasn't initially the expected outcome. People were still interested in flood mitigation and flood protection, but natural habitat was much higher than anticipated. And understanding that helped them tailor the campaign to get the parcel tax passed. So making that kind of outreach is a really important step for everything that basically follows. Understanding the important values that wetlands can provide is really a critical first step. once you understand those priorities, those needs, the things that you're most interested in, you can seek funding based on them. You know, especially if you're talking about grants, you can, if natural habitat restoration is something that the people are most interested in, that outdoor education or something like that, EPA and Fish and Wildlife Service are great places to look. If it's remediation of a site, you know, the brownfields program of the EPA, another good program that might be interesting in looking at. If it is flood protection and surge protection, then FEMA might be the place to look. The BRIC program that's, you know, somewhat new is a good place to think about, or something to think about. So understanding where your priorities and needs are is really an important part to also identifying the appropriate funding source, or if you're going to incorporate it into an existing program, it also helps you identify, well, which program is the right one to incorporate it, to integrate it with. This is certainly a more challenging effort. There's, like I said before, there's barriers to that. But if it's a step that's a great way to get long-term sustained funding. And if it's a step that you are interested in taking, understanding which program to implement that to is tied to understanding which ones you're most interested in. So, and yeah, local data. It's expensive, or it's challenging to get. It's certainly, but it's an important one. You know, if you're talking about understanding the role that they can play, that local data is critical in better understanding how to approach and the value that they can provide to a community. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, when you're looking at policy mechanisms and mapping tools, don't forget urban wetlands. You know, maybe they don't play well in the statewide, national-wide, or nationwide watershed goals, but they are still part of a watershed. And thinking about them in a watershed context, just their local watershed, is still very important. And that might require coordinating with other entities or other local governments, nearby neighboring governments. But having that openness creates an opportunity for shared resources and greater restoration success or protection success when you really try and still incorporate wetlands and think about wetlands as part of the watershed that they're within. Okay, a little over my time, so I'm sorry about that. But that is my presentation. So thank you, everyone, and hopefully I still have some time for some questions.
Bill, this is Lewis. I'm back, and thank you so much. I certainly wish I would have had you in the office when I was in environmental resource permitting. Man, you could have helped me out a lot then. So Marla and I will begin the questions that we've received in the questions panel, and I'd like to allow Marla to ask the first.
All right, great. Thanks, Lewis, and thanks, Bill. So that was an excellent presentation. I'm lucky to have you on my staff. So the first question on here is one that you and I have discussed a little bit before. Yeah, the question specifically is how protected are urban wetlands? So I think this, you know, part of this kind of gets into our discussion that we've had in terms of, you know, not wanting, you know, urban wetlands to be used for stormwater solutions. You know, what are perhaps then some of the, you know, do you have examples maybe of local ordinances where they've been developed to protect those urban wetlands specifically, or how are you considering protection as part of this project?
Right. No, great. Yeah, that is a great question. I don't want to give the impression that the only value of an urban wetland is its capacity to store stormwater or something like that. That's certainly not the case. It's a good selling point in the right circumstances, but there are a lot of instances where urban wetlands are perfectly healthy and functional wetland environments, and that just require protection. They don't need enhancement or restoration, and it would probably be a mistake really to try and incorporate something like that into you know, say a wastewater program. You know, actually the White Oak Bayou example is a really good instance of that, where initially it was the Army Corps that came to them and said that the wetlands you have in this urban area are pretty unique and worth protecting, and you know, they're at risk of development. And it was I mean, they're still working through it, but it was at least a 10-year process of just planning, and you know, developing that map was a big part of that planning, but protection has been kind of the highlight of that, where the areas that they identified as high priority are purely protection. Low priorities are areas where they may be willing to allow development and allow the mitigation to occur to help support maybe those mid-range areas, those medium areas. That's a good example of that. And I would say too, the Washington ordinances, that's the program I'm blanking on now that I mentioned before in the state of Washington. Those local ordinances are really, a lot of times they're implemented or adopted by a program like the stormwater, but they are focused on habitat protection primarily. They still offer those benefits, but that's a more protection focus as well. So yeah, no, that's a great question. And I don't want to give the indication that urban wetlands are meant to be storm sewers. That's not true, but it's a way to think about funding the projects. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Okay. All right. The next question is a bit of a cry for help, and it was from an anonymous attendee. So I would like to first suggest this individual take note of Bill's email address in the preceding slide, and you may wish to follow up by emailing him. But the question, I think what we have is basically an interest in knowing just, I guess, how much ASWM would be interested in consulting in a way. I'll read out the question. A local nonprofit in Petersburg, Virginia has a wetland that needs to be protected. And what we really need is to have someone point us in the right direction and help us sort out our options. The land is privately owned. How do we get in contact with someone who could help us get started? Is there some sort of way we could have a mentor to help guide us through the process? We are willing to do the work, but want to be sure we're headed in the right direction.
Marla, I think you might be more well suited to answering that than me.
I guess I would start out, I would encourage you to reach out to the Virginia DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality. Dave Davis and his team out there in the Wetlands Division are excellent. They've been doing this for decades. Dave was one of the chairs of the Association of State Wetland Managers Board of Directors for a long time. Just really great people at the DEQ. I'd recommend reaching out to them. If you want to try and find another nonprofit partner, I would recommend reaching out to Wetlands Watch. They're located in Norfolk, Virginia. They do excellent work. They focus on the local level. That's kind of their area of expertise in terms of working with local communities. So I would strongly recommend getting in touch with Wetlands Watch. Their phone number is 757-621-1185.
Thank you, Marla.
Yep. Okay, so the next question here, Bill. How challenging is it to give an economic value to urban wetlands?
Challenging. That is, so I mean, yes. Benefit cost analysis or cost benefit analysis is definitely a big barrier. That, when we're talking about that local data, that's really what I'm getting at is getting information that is specific to a wetland site that determines, gives you a dollar value on what it provides in terms of services. That is certainly, it's, there are organizations that do that, and it's very doable, but it's also costly, and there's an investment in that. I would advocate that it is a worthy investment, but it is it's certainly a barrier, particularly with the cost, to get that really local data on value, on economic value. Yeah.
I would just add to that. Bill's absolutely correct. It is the biggest challenge, I would say, in terms of wetland restoration and all of this kind of work, is getting that economic value, that benefit cost piece for natural functions of wetlands and floodplains, et cetera. ASWM did do a project on, we worked with the University of Southern Illinois and a graduate student there and their economics chair looking at some of the different tools that are out there for developing those economic values for wetlands. We had them narrow it down to those that were open source tools that are available for folks. that looked at various different types of functions. So we do have that publication available on our website at www.aswm.org. If you go to our website and you go to our publications page, you should be able to find some of that information there that might at least give you a start at looking at what some of the open source tools are that are available to folks.
I would also actually just, that made me think of one thing too, I would add on, if you're, a great example of a tool that's been developed, it's actually, I think it's very new, is the Cook County, Illinois Storm Store is a really, really interesting example of a tool that they've developed to help people understand the value that a wetland can provide. I think that's, again, it's related to stormwater, which a lot of the urban projects are, but it's a good one to look at. There was a webinar somewhat recently on that as well. That's worth a watch if you can find the recording. So.
All right, Bill, Marla, we've run out of time now, so I would like to urge anyone whose question has not been answered, please do find Bill's email from the slide deck there, from this thank you slide. And Bill, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule, Marla as well. I'd like to make a couple more announcements now that we've gotten to this point. Our next SWS webinar will be held on October 17th and will be presented by Rajashri Naik, who will be presenting work on the role of inland saline wetland ecosystems in the face of climate change. And our next Spanish SWS webinar will be held on September 23rd by Dr. Geraldo Norambuena Ramirez, speaking about aquatic birds monitoring, wetland conservation, and citizen science in Chile. As a reminder, all the Spanish webinars are offered free to members and non-members alike. And finally, make sure to subscribe or follow SWS social media channels like Facebook and LinkedIn to keep informed and support the society. We also have a YouTube channel where all of our webinars are posted 3 months after their original broadcast with multilingual subtitles. And newly added are wetland interviews, one in English and one in Spanish, posted on our YouTube page. If you're Spanish speaking, you can be certain to subscribe to the Latin American Caribbean Region's Facebook page as well. So thanks again for Bill and Marla for moderating, and our webinar sponsors, and to you, our audience, for participating today. Have a wonderful day and stay well.
Thank you.